Masizake is a township in Graaff-Reinet, which started development around 1857, when an influx of desperate Xhosa people came to the district after the devastating cattle killings that took place following the visions of the young Mbokodo, the Xhosa prophetess, in 1856. Translating to "We built it ourselves," uMasizake is among the first townships established to supply cheap labor to the white ruling class in South Africa, and Graaff-Reinet is the citadel of Afrikaner nationalism in the Karoo Midlands. This was the place of birth of Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe, anti-apartheid revolutionary and founding member of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, who served as its first president. It was also the place his widow, Zondeni Veronica Sobukwe, fled to following her being thrown out of their home at 6 Naledi Street in Kimberley after her husband's death in 1978. But Mum Zondeni was not just the wife of a struggle stalwart, as is the case with most wives of great African men. She was, in her own right, along with being a wife and mother, a revolutionary Pan-Africanist, an activist, community organizer, and carer. After all, you don't get the title of Mother of Azania for nothing. She was born to Kate, a teacher, and Mina Henry Mate in Hlobane in KwaZulu-Natal, and was the second of their 4 children, who were all girls. Initially, they lived on a farm acquired by her father, but as is the African story, they were evicted from the home under the pretense of a safety law and moved to a small room where they all shared the harsh workload because, unlike many others, they had at least been allowed to keep their cattle. Following missionary school, she went into her nurse's training at Victoria Hospital in Lovedale in the Eastern Cape. And in 1949, the hospital was embroiled in a labor dispute when African nurses sent a petition to hospital management. Note that South African nursing had been a very contentious racial arena beginning from around 1913, when the South African Trained Nurses Association had been formed, right up until 1942, when the white nurses refused to unionize with the black nurses, which culminated in the South African Nursing Act of 1944, which outlawed unions for nurses and forced them all to be a part of the South African Nursing Association, which ended their freedom of association. The petition led to the suspension of one nurse, Sister Dladla, and in protest, Veronica Mate was one of the leaders of a strike that brought the hospital to a standstill, with student nurses refusing to work or eat at the hospital and sleeping outside the hospital. At the TRC, Mum Zondeni said, "We were on a strike because we would do our jobs properly, but we were not properly treated. We wrote down our complaints, 10 of them. One nurse was told to leave, and we said we are all leaving. We were told to go home for 2 months on unpaid leave." During the strike was where she met a young Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe, who was the SRC president at the University of Fort Hare at the time, and who was with one of the organizations who had come to support the student nurses in their action. They were both taken aback by the political fervency and activism of the other. When asked how she felt about Mangaliso, Mum Zondeni replied, "I loved her at first sight." The 1949 strike led to Veronica's expulsion from the training program, but it had shown Veronica to be an effective activist indeed, and she was chosen to deliver a request for assistance to Walter Sisulu on behalf of the striking nurses. As she and Robert dated, Mum Zondeni worked in Durban at the Springfield and McCord hospitals, as well as at Ladysmith. They married in 1954 and moved to Johannesburg in Jabavu, and she received the marital name Mosami. The Sobukwes continued their activism under the umbrella of the ANC, with Mam Veronica being one of the women greatly involved in the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign developed by the ANC. The campaign began on June 26, 1952, as groups throughout South Africa executed various acts of defiance in main cities, such as 53 African protesters disobeying the curfews enforced on Africans in Johannesburg, and 25 protesters arrested for selling freedom stamps in Durban. Zondeni Sobukwe played a great role behind the scenes of the Defiance campaign. In 1959, she and her husband formed the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. They had been part of a group of Africanists who broke away from the ANC in objection to the ANC's 1955 Kliptown Charter that stated that the land belongs to all who live in it, both black and white.
But Nelson Mandela's attempt at a multiracial government in South Africa after the murder of men, women, children, and babies, and the rape of South Africa, a criminal settler colony that has been established like Israel there in that part of the world. I cannot go along with one man, one vote. Let me say why. If someone broke into your home, Mr. Donahue, and actually bum rushed your home, and black boots stomped your door down, and came in and robbed and raped everyone in the household, and was able to take the wealth of your home and parlay it into an empire. This is an invader. This is an intruder. This is a murderer. This is a burglar. This is a criminal. So you have no responsibility to share your home with them after they broke in and committed the crimes that they did.
On the 21st of March 1960, at the launch of the PAC's anti-pass campaign, Robert Sobukwe resigned from his post as lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand. He made last-minute arrangements for the safety of his family and left his home in Mbokodo. He intended to give himself up for arrest at the Orlando police station in the hope that his actions would inspire other black South Africans. Along the 8-kilometer walk to the police station, small groups of men joined him from neighboring areas like Pifeni, Dube, and Orlando West. As the small crowd approached the station, most of the marchers, including Sobukwe, were arrested and charged with sedition. When an estimated group of 5,000 marchers reached Sharpeville police station, the police opened fire, killing 69 people and injuring 180. This was the Sharpeville massacre. Less than 2 months later, Veronica Sobukwe watched her husband sentenced to 3 years in prison for the crime of inciting violence, a crime for which he ended up serving almost a decade. From this moment, her life became a living hell. Her family and comrades were harassed by the apartheid police to such an extent that she eventually sent her children to Lesotho for their safety and for them to have a semblance of a normal life. She would provide care services to those who were in struggle and who needed help, while trying to keep the party afloat even after political parties were banned under the Suppression of Communism Act. At the same time, Ma Veronica was fiercely campaigning for her husband, petitioning the government to allow his release in order for him to get Medicare after the Sobukwe clause passed. His health had deteriorated greatly, especially after he was operated on without her knowledge or agreement. He was also moved around from Benoni to Stoffberg to Witbank and eventually to Robben Island. At the TRC, she said, in February 1966, they transferred him to Karl Bremer. They did not tell me. I heard about this when he came back from Karl Bremer. He stayed there. He was admitted under a false name. They sent him to Karl Bremer under a false name. I do not know anything about that. He then came back. He was taken to Robben Island. They did not consult with me about this. When I went to visit him the following year, his condition deteriorated. I then wrote another letter. I was writing twice a year asking for his release. I wanted him to be treated. In 1965 or 1966, he complained that his food was served with broken glass. Advocate Sandy: "You mean broken glasses in his food?" Mrs. Sobukwe: "Yes, in his food. He was alone at that time. You would think why they would keep him alone in the cell. There are things that were done to people in jail at that time, and I am sure that they did these things to my husband because he was alone in the cell." Yet she never lost her spirit for the fight, petitioning the officials every year, twice a year, until eventually Sobukwe was released from prison in 1969, but had proven so dangerous that he was immediately banished to Kimberley. And Ma Zondeni, ever the dutiful wife, worked in Johannesburg and would visit regularly. In Kimberley, Sobukwe was still seen as being so dangerous that he was under 12 hours daily house arrest. She is quoted as saying, "Nothing came to my surprise or shock, because from the day I met him, he was in the struggle, and he died in the struggle. Everything was to be expected. I was not too grieved in the sense that I expected these things." Robert Sobukwe eventually died from lung cancer in 1978 after the apartheid government basically made it so hard for him to receive medical care that it may as well have kicked him into the grave. And that was it. She was kicked out of her home after her husband's death. They weren't needed anymore because the threat had been removed. Her children were teenagers studying in Lesotho and Botswana in the US, and she moved to Masizake Township, where she had to rebuild her life. She had a fantastic memory and remembered minute details of past events and people. She would tell those who cared to listen that she was amongst the last of the founders of the PAC. This she stated on a Mother's Day visit in May 2018 by the top-level leadership delegation led by PAC President Narius Moloto. But she involved herself as always in the community, and her revolutionary spirit never died. At the TRC hearings, she petitioned for her husband and for her peace of mind. She wanted to know what had happened while her husband was in solitary confinement. She spoke of the mental and psychological torture for her son Didane, who had been close to his father, and the mental health issues resulting from that trauma that led him down a path of crime. And when asked if that was all she wanted, she said yes, and then proceeded to request that the commission refurbish the schools in her area and build a sports field so that people were occupied in a proper way. Even in her greatest grief, she was still thinking of her community. And that's probably why the ANC conveniently removed her from much of public consciousness along with her husband. It wouldn't be convenient to know that the real Nelson Mandela, the threat to the apartheid government, was a man who had left the ANC in 1957, along with his dedicated wife. In 2018, Veronica Sobukwe received the Order of Luthuli in silver, which is awarded to South Africans who have made a meaningful contribution to the struggle for democracy, human rights, nation building, justice and peace, and conflict resolution. And on the 15th of August 2018, she went on to become an ancestor after 91 years. And Ma Veronica's story is a great reason why I've actually decided to make this series. The great Eskia Mpahlele wrote an entire poem about this clearly amazing woman. And there is a lot written about her, but as with this video, very little is about her, especially after she meets her husband. And that's fine if that's all she was. But Mum Veronica was a community activist. She actually spent a lot of her married life technically alone. with her children out of the country for their own protection, and with her husband imprisoned. She was a woman fighting a system, and for that she paid a heavy price.
So this is the piece that I have put together for this African queen. The African queen. Azania, behold the African queen. Zondeni Veronica Sobukwe, the mother of Azania. We honor you, valiant monarch, you whose life was dedicated to the liberation of your people and your land. Mother, servant, friend of the African dream of liberation and humanity. You, caring, giving servant of God, this humble ululation of song and gratulation comes from the deep, deep heart of the Azanian nation.
What were your thoughts when you heard of Mama Sobukwe's passing?
So the one thing is that I think I was appalled that there had been so little said about her previous to this, and I think that it's a disgrace and a great pity that many people have to discover her in her death, and that they didn't have the opportunity to be acquainted with her ideas, her dynamism, her contribution, and to recognize and valorize her while she was alive. And I think that this speaks as well to the way that we have treated memory and treated, narratives of history in this country and her story. There's a mono-narrative, mono-memory. There is a constructed memory, official memory that the state tends to mediate and tends to curate. So these curated memories, which suggest that only a few people have made a valid contribution and that only a few people are worthy of remembrance and of recollection. There's also a very masculine bent to that. So where the masculinized struggle, the heroes, never the sheroes, the men, the lions, and so on and so forth. And yet we forget that women have played a huge role. And it's not just as the women who were keeping the fires burning.
Burning at home, the home fires burning.
The wives, the mothers, and it's much more profound. Standalone political actors and political activists and revolutionaries. There was resonance. People meet and marry and love each other in struggle because there's resonance, and this is something that of course has not really been picked up much on in the way that we've framed our struggle discourses.
Now, the names of people like Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Albertina Sisulu, kind of roll off our tongue of post-apartheid South Africa. Is it unfair to say that Mama Sobukwe's name was forgotten in the narrative of this new South Africa?
So in the same way that Tate Sobukwe's name was erased by the colonial apartheid regime, and there's not a single voice recording, as we know, that can be found even to this day, that can be traced of him. I mean, all this was intentional, it was engineered. It is equally disgraceful that post-1994, his name and his legacy has continued to be erased, but that Ma Sobukwe's legacy and voice have also been erased. So there were many opportunities to excavate their ideas, to speak to her, to document her, to interview her, to memorialize her, and to historicize and contextualize her contribution in relation to her own being, and also to perhaps help us to understand him even better. And all of those opportunities were either diminished, lost, or completely there was no interest in using those opportunities. And now we weep, the nation is the chief mourner at the last moment, and I think it's completely unpalatable and unacceptable. A few months ago, many of us spent a lot of time deliberately rewriting Nomzamo Madikizela back into history and our story because of the erasure, as juxtaposed to Madiba, the complete erasure and demonization that she had gone through. But I think that we have, in doing so, we must not neglect the even more profound lack of knowledge and lack of memory and complete obfuscation that has been rendered, the violent obfuscation, the violent unremembrance that has been rendered on Mrs. Sobukwe.
Now, if you had a young South African come up to you today and say, Who is Mama Sobukwe? Why is she important?
Why are we crying?
Even, as a South African woman, as a political analyst, What would your answer to her be? This is who she was, and this is why she must never be.
So I would really say that, you know, she was half of the most powerful liberation power couple in this country, in my opinion. She was the obscured half of that power couple. She was a woman who stood on the shoulders of great liberation theologians. She was grounded in a social ethic of service long before stomach politics and gravy trains began to come by. She was a woman who was ostracized, not by judicial decree, but ostracized by social conditions. Remember that Ndate Sobukwe is the only person for whom a legislation was passed, the Sobukwe Clause. The only person, as far as I know, even globally, you know, the only person, and just to be associated with Mrs. Sobukwe under those circumstances was to risk so much, was to risk similar ostracization, was to risk imprisonment, torture, banishment. And I think that we shouldn't forget the level of emotional torture. Torture is not just about, is not only being electrocuted, it's not physical manifestation, being electrocuted or dogs being set on you. It's also the mental anguish of loneliness, of uncertainty, of being rejected, of being vilified, and of being completely alone. And I think that the politics of relegation have further ostracized her. So we relegate her to the wife, the widow, nameless and faceless. Very few people would have known, would have recognized her had you shown a picture of her.
And for that reason, even if the information I can find about her is minimal at best at this point, I want her remembered. Because as with so many people under apartheid, Zondeni Veronica Sobukwe is proof that the apartheid government was brutal